Strengths are important because when we see research on strengths, how people use strengths in life and at work, we realize really fundamental things. Like when you get to use your strengths, if you get to play on your strengths a lot at work, then you like your work and you're better at your work. You're more effective when it comes to critical decision making if you're utilizing your strengths. You're also unhappy if you don't get to use your strengths at work. There's actually almost 15% who use so very little of their strengths at work that they're actively disengaged at work. Now, the purpose of this is for us to get more of our strengths in play, more of our strengths at work. So, what is a strength? Well, a strength is a talent that you have, and they can be either primary or secondary. The secondaries are also called peripheral strengths because they're not front and center, they're in the peripheral. Now, primary strength, that's the good stuff. But the challenge is that we already know about this. The primary strength is what you've heard growing up. Oh, you're so good at You're so good, so talented at And you hear that and you start believing it, and maybe you have a talent, maybe you develop a talent. But here's the thing, the primary strengths, you've known it all your life. You're so good with numbers, you're so structured, you're so good at planning, you're so good at dealing with conflict, you're so good at communicating, you're so good at listening, you're so good at cutting to the chase, you're so good at making the complicated seem obvious and simple, you're so good at convincing. So these things are primary strengths if you've heard them your whole life and you take them kind of for granted. Like, yes, I know that I am Whatever it is, if that's the thing that you've always heard, your constant time growing up, you've been refed this, that's a primary strength. Peripheral or secondary strengths are the ones that you maybe don't use so often. Maybe you use them in a hobby, or maybe you use them in a something outside work, or maybe you use them as a part of work, but absolutely not at your core. So it could be a slumbering talent. And if you put that front and center, then you really get development. I mean, your primary strengths, you develop those all the time because that's probably what you've been hired to do also. But your secondary strengths, that's where you have a really interesting trajectory if you start developing them. The shadow side of it is actually that, well, there's a shadow. Sometimes when you use a strength too much, you can see the shadow. If you're planning, sometimes you're rigid. You get that feedback. If you're really good at pointing in one direction and said, follow me, let's do this, and people go, yeah, whoa, I promise you, that person gets feedback that, sometimes you step on people's toes. And maybe you could just, tone down and be more empathic, more listening, more Now, that's not what we're going to do. Because if you're good at something, if you have a strength, I promise you, there's a shadow when it's too much of the good stuff. So, primary strengths come with shadows quite often. Secondary strengths, we don't use them so much that we see their shadows. But if we start developing them, we'll start to see shadows. Shadows are not the same as weaknesses. Weaknesses are things that we are bad at, stuff that we suck at, because we can't be good at everything. And when we're bad at that, we shouldn't try to develop it, because it takes too much energy and time to create a small shift, a small change. So the key to understanding strength-based development is that strengths, primary or secondary, we develop those. Weaknesses or shadows, we tolerate them, but we compensate or neutralize them. We don't try to develop them. We compensate for them or we neutralize them, sometimes with processes, sometimes with structures, and quite often with people that we surround ourselves with. So we'll be looking at that also. Primary strengths, secondary or peripheral strengths. What about the shadows? What about the weaknesses? And what about our structures or the people around us that help us compensate or neutralize for the weaknesses and the shadows? Because the strengths, primary and secondary, those are the ones that we develop.